All right, we're back. Brutus is here to help. All right, let's finish off World War I. So when we left off, we had some problems. We were starting to see mutinies in the French army in 1916. We pull up to 1917. Russia's armies also begin to mutiny, and their government eventually collapses. The Tsar quits, and then the country is taken over by Lenin and his Bolsheviks. Story that we'll look at in a little more detail in Unit 2. And then eventually Russia leaves the war. So the Germans are very optimistic about possibly winning the war. Can you lay down? About winning the war. Probably not in a military defeat, but perhaps pushing France and Britain to peace negotiations that would favor Germany. Now, this is all predicated, of course, on the United States staying out of the war. And so let's look at what has been going on with the Americans since 1914. In 1914, the United States had, of course, declared neutrality. In fact, the President Woodrow Wilson had called on Americans to be neutral in thought and deed. You have to remember, in the United States this time, there were a lot of first-generation immigrants who, were rooting for their countries back home, and the last thing we wanted was for that to spill over into the United States. So Wilson called on neutrality and called on Americans to be neutral in thought as well as in their deeds. And generally, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for the war. Most Americans were very grateful for the Atlantic Ocean, separating them from Europe's problems. Nobody really wanted to be involved in this war, other than manufacturing and business, and we'll see what the effect is on that later. But eventually, the U.S. slowly does find itself being pulled into the war for several reasons. One, economic ties. There's a lot of money to be made selling to Britain and France. Selling goods to the British and the French, and in fact, loaning money to Britain and France so they can buy goods from the U.S. So we're going to give them money to spend back in our country, and they also have to pay that money back. So this is going to lead to problems after the war. We're going to loan some money to the Germans as well, but not as much. Eventually, loans to Britain and France, about $2 billion. Loans to Germany, about $3 million. So we definitely have a financial interest in making sure Britain and France win this war. Not so much the Germans. And a lot of this information I'm giving you, particularly about the money, that stuff is going to come out after World War I, when the Americans are like, why did we get involved in this war again? And that's where a lot of this information comes from. Second thing that's going to slowly pull us in is Germany's submarine warfare. And here's a picture of a merchant ship being blown up by a German submarine. Initially, the Germans practiced what was called unrestricted submarine warfare, which basically meant we're going to sink the Germans, think what they want, without warning. They're not giving any warnings. On May 7th, 1915, the Germans sank a passenger ship called the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland, which killed 1,200 people, including 130 Americans. Now, the Lusitania was a passenger ship, but it was carrying munitions for Britain and France. And it's thought that the torpedo that hit the Lusitania hit where the munitions were being stored. So you get multiple explosions. Those munitions shouldn't have been carried on a passenger ship. Okay, whoever owned the Lusitania, those deaths are partly their responsibility as well. Now, in order to keep the Americans out, Germany agreed to what was called restricted submarine warfare, which basically meant warning ships, hey, we're about to sink you, so you should probably get off the boat. The problem with that is, in order to warn the ships, you have to come up from under the ocean, which can allow ships to fire at you. So the Germans weren't really happy about this, but they also recognized that getting the United States in was not something they wanted to do. So they agree to alter the rules of submarine warfare to keep the Americans out. Another thing Germans were doing, which we didn't find out for a long time, is fiddling around in Mexico's politics. Mexico during World War I, there was a lot of warfare within Mexico between Carranza, Obregon, Pancho Villa, and of course Zapata. And the Germans felt that as long as Mexico was an unstable country, that would keep the United States busy. And so we know that the Germans approached the Carranza government. We know that they gave military advisors to Carranza, but we also know that they approached Pancho Villa and gave him advice as well. So the longer Mexico fought with each other, the more likely the United States was going to be worried about Mexico and not about Germany. With the problems of 1917, Germany saw a way out. Basically, the Germans decided, as Mexico began to sort of somewhat calm down, Germany realized that the clock on the Americans was ticking, that the Americans were probably going to get into the war, which means Germany needed to finish the war while they could. So this led to a couple of changes. In January of 1917, Germany moved back to unrestricted submarine warfare. They figured they had to hit Britain and hit them hard. And the best way they could do that was to sink everything in the Atlantic they possibly could. Even if that provoked a war with the United States, Germany counted on at least a year before the U.S. would make it to Europe. Okay, because the U.S. would have to train, it'd have to mobilize an army, outfit the army, train the army, and then ship the army. So Germany figured, even if the U.S. jumps into the war, we have at least a year, and we can defeat Britain and France, or at least hurt them badly enough to a negotiated peace settlement before the Americans get involved. Now, so that's January of 1917. We already know that in February of that year, Russia begins collapsing. Okay, so that solves some of Germany's problems. On March 1st, the Zimmerman telegram was released. This was a telegram from Germany to Mexico, asking Mexico to attack the United States, and promising Mexico that when the war was over, Mexico would get back Texas and Arizona, and possibly parts of California. Zimmerman is the German ambassador who it's named after, and rather than deny the telegram, he admitted that yes, he had made this offer to Mexico, which may have been the dumbest thing any diplomat has ever done. Because what happens is, on April 4th, the U.S. declares war on Germany. Now, Germany is still counting on that year, that they can get a year before they have to deal with the Americans. However, by June of 1917, I forgot the exact number, but General Pershing, General Blackjack Pershing, the American general, and about 100,000 U.S. troops reach France. And a lot of these troops, of these 100,000, were already battle hardened from the Pershing expedition into Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa, but also winding up fighting Mexico's legitimate army, the Carranza, as well as fighting Pancho Villa. So you've got some battle-hardened troops in here already. The Americans begin girding themselves for war by selling Liberty bonds. This poster here, the Boy Scouts of America Liberty Loan Campaign, and also by trying to get recruitment up. Here's the thing, a lot of Americans did not rush down to join the army when war was declared. Now with World War II, that did happen. World War I, not exactly a rush. And so we actually have to institute a draft in order to get men into the Army. But you can see there's some attempt here in this poster to get men to join, to get people to join the Navy, the Marines, what was called the Army Air Service, and then also try and get civilians involved. And so this wheatless kitchen, meatless Monday, wheatless Wednesday, victory gardens. We'll see a lot of this in World War II as well. There's also a dark side to America's entry into World War I. After entry, the United States passes the Espionage and Sedition Act, which makes it a crime to, make sure I get this correct. Alien and Sedition Act, where is Alien and Sedition Act? All right, makes it a crime to criticize the war effort or obstruct the war effort or give aid to enemies of the United States. Okay. What this meant is the government now started going through people's mail, most particularly socialist newspapers and magazines lost their mailing privileges because many of the socialist newspapers and magazines were against the war. They saw World War I as nothing more than a way for rich people to get even richer. Okay, an effort by the capitalists to line their pockets with the blood of the common man. So a lot of censorship, a lot of going through the mail. Again, about 75 socialist newspapers and magazines lost their mailing privileges. German authors were pulled out of libraries. Many schools stopped offering German language as a possibility. In fact, here in Texas, our governor, Ma Ferguson, said that if English was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for Texas school children. The city of Brandenburg, Texas, changed its name to Old Glory, Texas. We talked about how this gave a push to the prohibition because of Schlitz, Anheuser-Busch, Pabst. Those are all German names. German opera was not performed, which is probably a good thing. Hamburger became Victory Burger. Okay. One man in Missouri named Robert Prager. Robert Prager had been born in Germany. Because of that, he was apprehended by his neighbors, tied up with an American flag, paraded through town, and then lynched. In Washington, D.C., a man who refused to stand during the Star-Spangled Banner was shot dead by a sailor. Eugene Debs, who had been the socialist candidate for president, was arrested and given a 10-year prison sentence for making a 4-minute speech against the draft. Okay, 10 years in federal prison for a 4-minute speech against the draft. And again, this was someone who had run for president 3 times as the socialist candidate. So, a bit of a hysteria problem here regarding this war. And I say opening our mail is probably a violation of civil liberties. This is also where we start getting into phone tapping as well, because that was another thing that comes about. The forerunner to the FBI, the GID as it was called, started tapping phones as well. And we'll pick up with that story because after World War I, when we don't have Germans to be hysterical about, we're going to be hysterical about socialists, communists, and black people. And that's going to lead to some problems. Even with the United States sending a token force under Blackjack Pershing, the Germans figured they needed to make an all-out effort to put an end to the war. And so, for the spring of 1918, the Germans planned their knockout punch. Yes, there were Americans in France, still not massive numbers. And so Germany was hoping one last big punch would knock out at least France. With Russia having withdrawn from the war, this now allows Germany to transfer about 50 divisions. Let me find out how many men are in the division. Anywhere from 10 to 15,000, and Russia has 50 of those. So at a minimum, yes, let's do basic math here. 1,000 troops at a minimum, a maximum of 750 troops. Okay. Those are all being transferred over to the French side of the war, which has been in stalemate for 3 years now. And the goal here, again, is to hit France and Britain hard enough to force them to sue for peace negotiations. And that's the overall goal here. So why does it fail? Well, it fails for the same reason the Schlieffen Plan failed. It asked soldiers to do too much, too quickly. Once again, supplies were not able to keep up with the advance. And once again, the soldiers were exhausted by the pace that they were expected to keep up. And so the whole thing really lasted about a month, where the Germans were they basically had a month window, and from March through April of 1918. Once they got to the end of April, they had blown themselves out. There was nothing left to give. They had suffered heavy casualties, and they occupied ground which had very little value and was going to be very difficult to defend once the counterattack came. So you can see here in this map the push made by the Germans. And again, they were fairly successful. They pushed a little bit here in Belgium and up in here, and then they made a major push along this part. But again, they're no closer to Paris than they have been for the last 4 years. By the end of it, the Germans had lost 240,000 dead. That was just in one spot. Overall, the Germans lost 1 million men. The whole initiative lasted for about 6 months. The first month was the biggest push. But after 6 months, the Germans had lost 1 million men. And those have been some of their best men. Well, now it was time for Britain, France, and the Americans to hit back. And so what's called the 100 Days Offensive, you can see here in this map, these yellow lines are from the spring offensive. So you see this here, and then now the push back by the British, the French, and the Americans. Here's the front line on September 25th, a solid yellow line, and here's the front line by November 10th, pushing back. So again, pushing back into Belgium. Okay, and showing again a different map showing German losses in the war. German losses in the 100 Days Offensive. Okay, so a pretty substantial piece of territory being lost. And in one spot, as the German army began to collapse, there was one day where the Germans were pushed back 34 miles in a single day, which would have been disastrous, which is disastrous. But coming on top of the 1 million men that were just lost is even worse. And so Germany sued for peace. These are Americans. On November 9th, the German monarch collapsed. And on November 11th, Germany became a democracy, which is what all these crowds are doing out here in Berlin. They are celebrating the birth of a new Germany. And that is also the day, November 11th, that the armistice goes into effect. Now, an armistice is not a surrender. An armistice is a ceasefire. The two sides had agreed to stop shooting at each other, okay? But it is not a surrender. Germany does not see what they're doing as a surrender. It simply is a ceasefire to try to negotiate an end to the war. But none of the Germans, either the military or the public, were of the opinion that Germany had been defeated in the war. Okay, and that's going to play a large role. This idea that Germany was never defeated is going to play a large role in the rise of Hitler in the 20s and 30s. But the war essentially ends in November. The peace treaties won't be signed until June. But the war leaves behind an awful lot of death and destruction. We would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, what this young man has, what back then was called shell shock. This man was totally catatonic unless he heard the word bomb, at which point he would hide under his bed and refuse to come out. It left an awful lot of this. French soldiers destroyed by the war. There's no other word for it. Burn victims from various gases who would need long-term care. The French called these the men with the broken faces, but you saw these in France and in Germany, and to a lesser extent, Britain. And they would basically wear ceramic masks that would hook over behind their ears like a pair of glasses, and that would cover the ruins of their face.